MarkRogersTV here to close up shop on college football's Week 9. The BCS just about as messy as it has been all season, but we did get one slight clarification tonight with Mizzou blowing a 17-point lead with 12 minutes to play at home against South Carolina. Steve Spurrier inserting Connor Shaw, and Shaw worked his magic, running and throwing the comeback into play for South Carolina, 201 yards through the air and 3 touchdowns. And when Mizzou place kicker Andrew Baggett clanked one off the left upright from 24 yards away in overtime, the Gamecocks had completed the 27-24 win. Again, Mizzou blows 17-point lead with 12 minutes to play. So Mizzou would apparently be out of it at 7-1. There's too many undefeated teams. But at the same time, what's been said by people in the know for the last few years since the SEC has established dominance in college football, that an SEC champion with one loss would certainly get into the championship game. Well, Mizzou still just has the one loss, and they've got up ahead on the schedule Ole Miss and Texas A&M. Those would certainly be wins that would help them tremendously and the SEC championship game. And again, defeating Alabama, the number 1 team and 2-time defending champion in the SEC championship game, could get Mizzou back into the running. So this is certainly a hit for the Tigers, but they're at 7-1, and they control destiny in the SEC and possibly beyond that. Let's start from the top now, because that was the significant movement tonight was Missouri. But Alabama wins over Tennessee 45-10. They were a 28-point favorite. And yes, Tennessee had the impressive win at home against South Carolina, but the Tide at another level from everybody else in the SEC and maybe in college football right now. The Tide led 35-0 at half. This game, they could have called the score on this one. And really, since that test they got from Texas A&M at College Station back in September, the Tide's been rolling. They beat a good Rebels team 25-0. The last 6 opponents, Alabama's outscoring the last 6, 246-26. They actually went on a binge of 104-0 before Tennessee scored. The running attack is back in mode after the rough start against Virginia Tech in Game 1. Kenyon Drake with 89 yards. TJ Yeldon with 72 and 3 rushing touchdowns. Amari Cooper, who's been slowed by injuries this season, one of the best wide receivers in college football last season, catching 59 for 11 touchdowns, cost his first touchdown of the season against Arkansas last week. He added another today among 5 receptions for 75 yards. He's finally getting healthy and into the mix for Alabama, and that's scary for opponents. Nose tackle Brandon Ivory missed the game due to unspecified medical reasons. He will need to get back into the flow. He's the main staple of that Tide rush defense up the middle at nose tackle, Brandon Ivory. So the Tide has a bye. Of course, the big showdown with LSU in Tuscaloosa in 2 weeks, November 9th, and then the Auburn Iron Bowl game, which could mean everything in the SEC West and possibly for the BCS championship game on November 30th, before, of course, the Tide would have to play in the SEC championship game against possibly Missouri or now South Carolina back in the mix. So that's the resume for the Tide. They are clearly the number 1 team, although in Tennessee, they're still the red team, but they are the number 1 team consensus. Okay, Florida State annihilated North Carolina State 49-17, and the Noles, like the Tide, could have named the score here. They led it 35-0 after the first quarter. Okay, so this sets up the showdown next week in the ACC with Florida State hosting Miami. The Canes have not been impressive, but they're undefeated too. And if you've watched me at all in my video posts, you know that I'm not into style points and beauty points, but I understand in this system we have to look at the type of victory. Is it impressive, or are they just slugging it out? Unfortunately, we don't have a true playoff system, and even next year we won't. So we've got to go with style points here, and Florida State has been awfully impressive. But they do have Miami. They've got the game at Florida, which right now Florida State, with Oregon on its heels in terms of BCS points, has to be rooting for the Gators to get their act together and win out up to that finale taking on Florida State. So they'll be rooting for the Gators to beef up their record. Then Florida State would have an ACC championship game against either Miami or Virginia Tech. So that's the slate for Florida State, who after the thumping of Clemson certainly looks like one of the 2 or 3 best teams in America. The other one would be, well, let's first talk about Miami because the Canes are undefeated. Yes, the last 3 weeks they have not looked impressive against Georgia Tech and specifically taken to the wire by North Carolina down to the last 15 seconds on a Thursday night last week, and against Wake today, falling behind 14-3 before the Canes pull it out with a late touchdown with 53 seconds left from Duke Johnson, winning over Wake 24-21. Okay, the Canes' best wins against Florida. It looked really impressive at the time, but the Gators are stumbling. So they, like Florida State, Miami, wants Florida, the Gators, their rival, to win a lot of football games down the stretch to beef up the BCS points. The big game after the Florida State game, if the Canes can somehow pull off the upset next week, would be against Virginia Tech the very next week. So Miami would have to go back-to-back against Florida State and a Virginia Tech team that lost to Duke today, but will still pose a challenge. And then the ACC championship game, probably a rematch against Florida State. So that's what the Canes have facing them. The way they're playing, they don't look like a national championship contender, but we can't discount the Canes. They are 8-0, and they've got Florida State, Virginia Tech, and an ACC championship game to play. Okay, everybody's talking about Alabama, Oregon probably being the best match. Oregon was challenged in the first half tonight by UCLA at home, 14-14, and then the Ducks dominated on offense and defense in the second half. They limited the Bruins to just 58 total yards after halftime in breezing to the win, 42-14, so they shut out UCLA 28-0 in the second half. DeAnthony Thomas back off the injured list. Really not a factor in this football game. 10 carries for 31 yards. He caught 3 for 17. It again was the Byron Marshall and Thomas Tyner show as they racked up 210 rushing yards between them and 4 rushing touchdowns. Okay, this is what the Ducks have. And even though they are number 3 in the BCS rankings right now behind Florida State at 2, this is the reason why the Ducks should make up ground and finish number 2 if they win out. This game against UCLA, the 12th ranked team in the country, coming in. Next week against Stanford, that's on November 7th. That's coming up actually in 2 weeks on a Thursday night. Gotta love that. November 29th against Oregon State, who's probably going to lose its second game tonight against Stanford, but still could be a 9-2 football team at that point. And then a Pac-12 championship game against, wow, it's up for grabs in the South right now. That could be Arizona State or UCLA. I think the Bruins are the best team, so they could have a rematch with UCLA, or they could play Arizona. All right. Ohio State has not been impressive in beating teams like Wisconsin, Northwestern, and Iowa. Statement game for the Buckeyes tonight against Penn State. 63-14. They led it at half, 42-7. Braxton Miller was sharp. 18 of 24, 3 touchdown passes, no picks. Carlos Hyde is a beast. He's a monster. He runs the football with purpose. 16 times for 147 yards. He didn't see the football barely into the third quarter. He was out of the game. Braxton Miller out of the game in the fourth quarter. This was the best defensive effort the Buckeyes have played this season against a quality opponent. They finally got a pass rush on a quarterback. Christian Hackenberg harassed all night by Noah Spence in particular. Best wins right now for the Buckeyes. Discard Northwestern. The Wildcats have fallen apart with 4 consecutive losses. The best wins right now are Wisconsin. And although the Badgers are just 5-2 and not even in the top 25 or just the fringe of the top 25, Wisconsin's a quality team. They're one of the top 15 or 20 teams in the country. The second loss, of course, a controversial one at Arizona State. Best wins, Wisconsin and Penn State right now. And really the big one for Ohio State, they got 3 cream puffs coming up to a certain extent with Illinois, Indiana, and Purdue is Michigan. So the Buckeyes fans happy to root for Michigan to win out before the Buckeyes play them in Ann Arbor. And then Ohio State could have a Big Ten championship game against Michigan, or most likely, well, who knows about Nebraska after losing to Minnesota today, or most likely Michigan State could be an impressive foe if the Spartans can win out and be 11-1 when the Buckeyes play them in Indianapolis. All right, Baylor 7-0 after just thumping Kansas today, 59-14. Baylor's season starts next week. Baylor's been been just lights out on offense, as we know, scoring close to 70 points per game. But their best opponent to date is Kansas State. This is how bad the Bears' schedule's been. Kansas State is by far the best opponent, and the Wildcats are 3-4 right now. Baylor's Big 12 competition to date is 9-21. Okay, the next 3 weeks, the season's on the line against Oklahoma, Texas Tech, and Oklahoma State. Those 3 teams, not 9-21, they're 21-3. And then even if Baylor navigates that, they have a bit of a downgrade, but still 2 quality opponents in TCU and Texas. So Baylor's season's in front of them clearly. So if they can win those games, they will certainly have proven their worth as a top 5 or top 10 team. Okay, again, Mizzou lost tonight, but does an SEC champion with 1 loss not get to the championship game? So we're not going to go with a complete breakdown of these teams, but take into consideration the same circumstance with Auburn. They won again tonight. The Tigers have just 1 loss. They would get to the BCS championship game possibly with a win over number 1 Alabama and an SEC championship game win. How did the Tigers not make it if they're able to do that? Other 1-loss teams, Stanford could still be there. An impressive win over Oregon, a Pac-12 championship game for the Cardinal. Clemson, probably not going to play their way into it because they've lost to Florida State and don't get a rematch in the championship game in the ACC. Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas Tech are beyond long shots, but I note them just because they only have 1 loss. And I know it's ridiculous, but Louisville's there with 1 loss, and Central Florida. How about Michigan and Michigan State out of the Big Ten? I know they have not looked impressive, and the Big Ten's rep is way down, probably the worst in its history. But Michigan or Michigan State wins out. They got 1 loss. They beat Ohio State in the championship game in the Big Ten. Who knows? Right now, it's up to Alabama, Oregon, and Florida State, and to a lesser degree, Ohio State, to sort this thing out. Now, we would love to hear from you. Follow us on Twitter at MarkRogersTV. Follow us here and subscribe to our YouTube channel at MarkRogersTV as well. We'd love to talk college football and hear from you right here on MarkRogersTV.